Rain was still coming down when the phone rang at 7:23 on Tuesday morning, and I almost didn't answer it. We'd been home from the reception for 3 days, not a real honeymoon. Aaron and I had booked Portugal for February when the flights were cheaper and the October chaos had settled. So we'd come back to our condo in the Glebe after the wedding and spent Sunday watching old movies in our pajamas with the curtains half open, and Monday decompressing, and Tuesday I was supposed to go back to work. Aaron had already left. I could smell his coffee still sitting in the kitchen. The screen said, "Vital Statistics, Province of Ontario." I stared at it. I was on the edge of the bed, half-dressed, one sock on. What does a government registry office want on a Tuesday morning in October? I answered. "Is this Paige, Harlow Whitmore?" The voice was a woman's, mid-range, professional. "It's Paige Whitmore now," I said. I'd been practicing saying that. We just got married on Saturday. A brief pause. "Yes," she said. "That's actually why I'm calling. My name is Christine. I'm a registration specialist with the Vital Statistics Office. Ms. Whitmore, I need you to come into our office today, as soon as you can manage it." Another pause, and then she chose her next words the way you choose each step across ice. "I'm going to ask you to come alone. Please don't mention this call to your husband before you come in." I sat very still on the edge of the bed with one sock on and the rain hitting the window. "Why?" I asked. "I'm not able to explain over the phone," she said. "But it is urgent, and it concerns your marriage registration. I'll be here until 4 o'clock. I need to back up, because to understand what that phone call actually meant, you need to understand who I was before it, who Aaron was. What I believed we were building, and why I had never once thought to question the foundation. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, which is a mining town 4 hours north of Toronto that gets more snow than it has any right to and produces more nickel than almost anywhere else on Earth. My dad worked maintenance at the Vale smelter for 22 years. My mom, Anita, worked the front desk at a dental office and took in alterations on weekends because there were 4 of us kids, and money always seemed to be leaving faster than it arrived. I understood early that you earned what you had. There was no other version of the story in that house. I left Sudbury for Carleton University in Ottawa at 18 on an entrance scholarship that covered roughly 40% of tuition. I waitressed the rest. I graduated with a degree in public administration, the kind of practical, unromantic degree that gets you a federal government job and a pension and a predictable life. And I was entirely fine with that. By 29, I had an analyst position at a department in the downtown core, a 2-bedroom condo in the Glebe that I'd saved 6 years for the down payment on, an RRSP I maxed out every February without fail, and a credit score of 782 on TransUnion. I had 2 close friends, my university friend Gwen, who worked in communications for the city of Ottawa and had the driest humor and the sharpest read on people of anyone I'd ever met. And my colleague Fatima, who was warm and perceptive and always noticed when something was wrong with me before I noticed it myself. I had routines I loved. Monday spin class on Bank Street. Wednesday dinners with Gwen at whatever new place she'd found. Sunday morning walks along the canal with a Tim Hortons in my hand and a podcast in my ears. I was not looking for Aaron when I found him. It was one of those public sector innovation nights in the Byward Market. Mandatory attendance, dressed up as professional development. I went because I had to and was already calculating the earliest polite exit when I ended up next to a man at the drinks table who was staring at the room with the specific expression of someone who had also been given no choice. "How much longer do you think we have to stay?" he said. Not even looking at me, just at the crowd. I was told 90 minutes counts as showing face. I said. He turned. Dark hair, quiet in his posture, not performing anything. I've been here 45, he said. I'm Aaron. Paige, I said. 43 minutes. We stayed until the venue closed. His full name was Aaron Whitmore. He was 35, originally from Ottawa, had spent 4 years in Vancouver for a tech job that hadn't worked out, and moved back 2 years prior to take a position with a software firm near the Rideau Centre. He was unhurried in conversation. He sent follow-up texts that referenced the specific thing you'd said, not just the general topic. On our second date, I mentioned I'd never read a certain novel that had come up, and on our third, he showed up with a copy from a used bookstore on Elgin. A post-it marking a chapter he thought I'd find interesting. I thought, this man actually pays attention. We dated for 2.5 years. Good years. Genuinely, unperformatively good. We went to Quebec City in January and walked the old city walls in the cold and ate too much poutine. In May, I drove him up to Sudbury to meet my family, and he shook my dad's hand and helped my mom with the dishes without being asked, and she texted me that night. I like him. He was upfront about money, which mattered to me more than almost anything else, given where I'd come from. He had some student debt from his undergrad, a car payment, modest savings. Not where I was, but honest about it and working steadily towards something. When we decided he should move into my condo, his lease being up and it making obvious financial sense, he insisted on paying his share of everything down to the utilities. He proposed on a Thursday evening in March. No big gesture. He'd been cooking, and I'd come home to the smell of garlic and white wine, and after dinner he'd said, "I've been carrying this around since February, trying to figure out the right moment. And I've decided there isn't a right moment. There's just the right person." He'd pulled a ring from his jacket pocket, white gold, small solitaire, exactly what I would have chosen. "Will you?" I said yes before I'd finished processing the question. We set the wedding for the following October. 13 months of planning, a venue in the Ottawa Valley, the caterer, the flowers, the photographer. 81 guests. Gwen as maid of honor. Aaron's best man was his oldest friend, Hugo Graves, who'd known him since childhood and who cried openly during our vows in a way that set off half the room. Because we were both practical people who valued transparency, we laid everything on the table before the wedding. Credit scores, account balances, debts, beneficiaries. We'd consulted a financial planner. We updated our wills. We were, as Gwen said at the rehearsal dinner, the most spreadsheet-compatible couple she'd ever encountered. And she meant it as a compliment, and we took it as one. The one thing Aaron had never fully talked about was Vancouver. Not in an alarming way. He'd mentioned a tech job that hadn't fit, a relationship that had ended badly. He'd said bad breakup once and then moved past it, and I hadn't pushed, because everyone has a chapter they don't love reading aloud. I had respected the closed door. That was the door I'd never thought to try. The Vital Statistics office was on O'Connor Street, 15 minutes from the condo. I called in sick, put on the first clothes I reached, and drove there through the rain. Christine met me in a small office off the main reception area. She was in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the careful, practiced manner of someone who had delivered difficult news before and learned that the plainest version was the kindest. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said. "Please, sit down." I sat. My hands were folded in my lap. I was wearing jeans and a fleece I'd pulled from the hook by the door. I probably looked exactly like a woman who had received a phone call she didn't understand, because I was. "When a marriage is registered in Ontario," she began, "our office runs a routine verification against federal and provincial records. Occasionally, that process flags a conflict." She opened a folder on the desk and folded her hands over it. In the case of your marriage registration, filed Saturday, the verification returned a match. The name and date of birth registered under your husband's information correspond with an existing marriage record. I looked at her. It means there is a marriage on file for Aaron Whitmore, she said carefully, registered in British Columbia 6 years ago that has not been legally dissolved. There is no divorce order on file, provincially or federally. The room was quiet. A printer was running somewhere down the hall. I could hear my own breathing. So our marriage, I said. A marriage entered into while one party has an existing legal spouse is void under Canadian law, she said. I'm very sorry. I looked past her to the window. A woman in a yellow rain jacket was walking a golden retriever along the sidewalk. The dog was sniffing a planter of dead marigolds. Tuesday morning in October, everything exactly as it should be, out there. Who is she? I asked. Christine shook her head gently. I'm not able to share that, but a family law lawyer can help you access the BCC records. That would be your best next step. I drove home in a state I can only describe as pressurized stillness, not crying, not panicking. Something in me had shifted into a colder, more functional register that I hadn't known I had access to. By the time I pulled into the parking garage, I had mapped out 3 steps. That was all I could hold at once. I stood in the shower with the water, as hot as it would go, and I thought about Vancouver. Aaron had lived there from 27 to 31. He'd said, a tech job that didn't fit. A bad breakup. Not a marriage. A marriage he had apparently decided not to end. I thought about Hugo. I thought about something Hugo had said at the rehearsal dinner, standing with his arm around Aaron's shoulders and a glass of Ontario Riesling in his hand, just starting his toast. Aaron, buddy, second time, you got it right. Aaron had laughed and talked right over him and redirected the whole moment so smoothly, so easily, that I'd forgotten it before the night was over. Second time. I had assumed he meant a serious relationship. A long one, the kind people call practically a marriage. He had meant a marriage. I got out of the shower and I called Gwen. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, there were 4 full seconds of silence on the line. Paige, she said, you are not going to confront him tonight. Tomorrow morning, first thing, you call a lawyer. You need to know your position before you say a single word to him. Do you understand? Bigamy is a criminal offense under the Criminal Code of Canada, I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere slightly outside my body. Section 290. I know, she said, which is exactly why you do nothing without legal advice first. Promise me. I promised. I called Sandra Chen the next morning. She was a family law lawyer on Metcalfe Street, recommended by a colleague who had been through a difficult divorce 2 years prior, and she was brisk and organized and entirely unsurprised by anything I told her. She walked me through my position clearly. The marriage was void ab initio. Legally, it had never existed. And Aaron could face criminal exposure. My condo, purchased before we met, was fully mine, no question. My RRSP was mine. She told me to gather documentation, everything I could find. It took 3 days to get a name. The BC Vital Statistics records are accessible through a formal request process that Sandra helped me navigate. The name on Aaron's first marriage certificate was Cecile Tremblay. She had been 28 at the time. The certificate was dated 6 years ago, June, in Vancouver. I found Cecile on LinkedIn. She was 34 now, living in Victoria, an elementary school teacher. In her profile photo, she was standing in front of a mural of blue herons, smiling, and she looked like someone who had, by all appearances, moved forward with her life. I stared at her photo for a long time. Then I sent her a message. Her reply came within the hour. "I think I know what this is about. Can I call you?" We talked for 40 minutes. She cried twice. I didn't, not on the phone. I'd decided to save that for later, when I could be alone with it. She told me they had separated 5.5 years ago. After a year of marriage, she described as confusing more than painful. Aaron had grown distant, distracted, told her eventually that he thought they'd married too young. She had agreed, more sad than surprised. He had said he would handle the legal process. She had signed the separation agreement, trusted him to file the final divorce application with the court, and received his assurances at each step that it was moving through the system. It never moved through anything. He never filed. She had spent 5.5 years believing she was a divorced woman. "When did you find out you weren't?" I asked. "Right now," she said, "when you messaged me." I had to sit with that sentence for a moment before I could keep going. Aaron had not forgotten to file the divorce. He had chosen not to, in whatever slow, cowardly, unexamined way those choices get made. Month after month of not doing the difficult thing until the difficult thing has accumulated so much mass that you convince yourself it can't be moved. And when he'd met me and things got serious, and I started talking about futures and finances and moving in together, he had simply let it continue. Let the gap between what was real and what he was telling me grow quietly wider, the way a crack in a wall does when you paint over it instead of filling it. He had stood at an altar in the Ottawa Valley in front of 81 people, in front of my father, in front of Gwen, in front of my mother, who had saved for 18 months to afford the trip, and taken vows that he was legally not permitted to make. Cecile and I talked a while longer. She told me she already had a lawyer, had called one within an hour of getting my message. I told her Sandra Chen would be in touch. Before she hung up, she said, "I'm sorry this happened to you." I said, "I'm sorry it happened to both of us." There was a small silence between us that held more than either of us had words for just then. She said, "Yeah." And then we hung up. I spent the next 11 days performing the most exhausting role of my life. I cooked dinners. I watched television. I sat across from Aaron at breakfast with my coffee in both hands and watched him talk about work, about his commute, about whether we should go to March for better weather. And I nodded and asked follow-up questions and cataloged everything in front of me. The face I'd trusted, the voice I'd believed, the hands that had held mine in front of all those people. The distance between who I had thought he was and who I now knew him to be had no floor I could locate. I went back to spin class. I called my mom and told her everything was fine. It was not fine, but I was building something, and I needed to not collapse before it was finished. Every lawyer call, every document Sandra requested, every piece of correspondence. I handled it during the day while he was at work, and I filed it all in a folder I kept inside a box in the back of the closet under winter things. I chose a Friday evening, 11 days after the wedding. Aaron had made a reservation at a wine bar in Westboro we'd been to twice before. Small plates, low lighting, the kind of warm and quiet atmosphere that feels like a small occasion without requiring one. He'd suggested it as a belated celebration dinner, just the two of us, something low-key before the Portugal trip. I let him drive. I let him order the wine. I let him tell me about his week while the candles burned between us. When the first course arrived, I set my fork down. "I need to tell you something," I said. He looked up. The easy, settled expression on his face, so familiar, the one I had read as honesty for 2.5 years, shifted just slightly when he saw mine. The morning after we got home, I said, I received a call from the Vital Statistics Office. They flagged our marriage registration. He went very still. There is an existing marriage on file for you in British Columbia. Cecile Tremblay. Married 6 years ago. The divorce was never filed. The court has no record of any dissolution. I kept my voice level. I had rehearsed this. In the shower, in the car, at my desk, standing in the kitchen while he slept. Our marriage is void, Aaron. It never legally existed. The restaurant continued around us. Someone laughed at the bar. A server passed with a tray. Aaron's face had gone the color of the linen tablecloth. He started. I also spoke with Cecile, I said. She didn't know the divorce hadn't been filed. She trusted you to handle it. She spent 5.5 years believing she was a divorced woman. I paused. She found out the truth when I messaged her last week. He closed his mouth. He looked at the table. You stood in that chapel, I said, in front of 81 people, in front of my father, who flew down from Sudbury and pressed his suit and cried during the recessional. And you took vows that you were not legally permitted to take. You knew. You had to have known the whole time. Paige. His voice cracked on my name. He reached across the table. I moved my hands into my lap. Don't, I said, quietly, no heat, just a fact. He sat back. He looked like a man who has run to the edge of a room and found no door. My lawyer's name is Sandra Chen, I said. She'll be in contact with yours this week. I've already begun the nullity process. Our condo is mine. It was always mine. My accounts are mine. I've documented everything. I looked at him steadily. There is also a question of a criminal referral. Bigamy under Section 290. I haven't made a final decision on that, but I want you to understand that I have every document in order, and that decision is entirely mine to make. He said, I was going to tell you. When? I asked. I meant it as a real question. I genuinely wanted to know what he'd imagined, where in the future the moment existed where this resolved itself. He said nothing. When? I asked again. I don't know, he said, and he sounded, for the first time in the whole conversation, like he was telling the truth. I kept thinking I'd figure it out first. You let me plan a wedding for 13 months, I said. You let me buy a dress. You let my mom take in the seams on her suit jacket because she wanted to look perfect for me. You let Hugo give a toast. I stopped. You let me believe I was married. I picked up my purse, set my napkin on the table, and stood. Gwen was parked a block and a half east, engine running, exactly where she'd said she'd be. I got in and she handed me a travel mug of tea she'd made at home, chamomile, which she knew I drank when I was stressed. She didn't say anything. She pulled out into traffic and drove, and I sat watching the lights of Westboro slide past the window, and I let myself cry for exactly 20 minutes, because I had decided in advance that was the amount I was giving it that night. Sandra was extraordinary. Because the marriage had never been legally valid to begin with, there was no divorce proceeding, only a declaration of nullity, which moved cleanly and without contest. My condo was mine, as it had always been. My RRSP was mine. I had kept my finances separate throughout our relationship, which had been my idea from the beginning. The practical decision of a woman who had grown up watching money cause damage, and it turned out to be one of the most important choices I had ever made without knowing why. Cecile Tremblay's divorce from Aaron was finalized 4 months later. She messaged me when it was done. 2 lines. It's over. Thank you for finding me. I wrote back, take good care of yourself. I meant it completely. Hugo called once, about 3 weeks after everything had settled into the wider circle. He said he'd known about the Vancouver marriage, but had believed, or convinced himself to believe, that Aaron had sorted it out before things with me had gotten serious. That Aaron had told him it was handled. I believed some part of that. I told him that standing by someone through one version of their life didn't require you to look away from what that cost someone else, and that he'd have to live with what he'd chosen not to ask about. He said he knew. I wished him well and didn't reach back. Aaron didn't contest anything. I think the weight of what he'd been carrying, 5.5 years of a deception that had grown from laziness into something closer to active fraud, was so heavy by the end that he simply couldn't find the energy to fight for more of it. I didn't pursue the criminal referral. Sandra and I made that decision together. I needed my life back, not his destruction. Those are different things, and it matters to know which one you actually want. I got my life back. I repainted the bedroom, the color Aaron and I had chosen together, a grade that he'd preferred and I'd always found a bit flat. I rolled over on a Saturday in February with Gwen, the two of us in old clothes with a podcast running and a pot of lentil soup going on the stove. The new color was a deep, warm terracotta I'd wanted since before he'd ever moved in. When we finished, I stood in the doorway and looked at the room and felt, for the first time in months, that it was mine. I went back to Monday spin class. I went back to Wednesday dinners with Gwen. I added Sunday walks with Fatima along the canal, which became a fixed ritual before either of us had formally agreed to it. I called my mom every Sunday evening while I prepped my food for the week, and after about 8 weeks, she stopped asking careful questions about how I was holding up and started telling me about the neighbor's ongoing fence dispute, which was how I knew I must have started sounding like myself again. I am not going to tell you that I came through this without damage. I didn't. I spent months lying awake at 3 a.m, running back through 2.5 years of memories and holding each one up to the light, searching for what I should have caught. The Vancouver chapter he'd gently closed, that flicker of something wrong in Hugo's toast, gone before I could name it. The way Aaron had never quite finished the story of who he'd been before Ottawa. The thing about someone who is very skilled at carrying a secret is that they don't look like a person carrying a secret. They look like a person who loves you. And sometimes, often, I think, they do love you in whatever incomplete and avoidant way they are capable of. That doesn't make it less of a betrayal. It doesn't mean there was some sign you failed to read. It just means that some people love their own avoidance more than they love the person in front of them. And the only thing you can do when you discover that is decide what happens next. What I decided was this. One person's cowardice was not going to be the defining fact of my life. I had built everything I had from a town where the winters lasted 6 months, and you understood from childhood that security was something you constructed, not something that arrived. I could build again. I knew how. My credit score is 801 now. My RRSP is the healthiest it has ever been. I still have Gwen, and I still have Fatima, and I still have my Monday spin class and my Tim Hortons on Sunday mornings and my lentil soup in February. The bedroom is terracotta, and it is exactly right. And sometimes, when the October light comes through the condo windows low and amber in the late afternoon, and the canal is doing what the canal does in autumn, all gray and silver and quietly beautiful, I think about a Tuesday morning. Rain on the glass, one sock on, a government number on my phone that I almost sent to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. Some things that feel like they're taking everything from you are only clearing the ground.